Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring a cold case that sat in silence for 3 full decades. Skeletal remains found in the woods of Alabama, hundreds of miles from home, with no name, no story, and no justice. For 30 years, nobody knew who he was. And the person responsible for putting him there has never been held accountable. Here's what happened. Imagine being erased. Not just from the world, but from the record. No name on a case file. No family knowing what happened to you. No face on a missing poster that anyone connected to the bones found deep in the trees. For 30 years, that was the reality for one man, a man from Maryland who somehow ended up as unidentified remains in coastal Alabama, over 900 miles from home, known to investigators and to the world by nothing more than a geographic placeholder. Baldwin County John Doe, that was his name for 3 decades. That was all anyone had. And then, in 2023, science gave him back something that death had taken away. His name, Tracy Lee Tetso, a real person, with a real life, from a real place, who had been reported missing long before anyone even knew to look for him in Alabama. But here is the part that should keep you watching all the way to the end of this video. Giving a victim back his name is not the same as giving him justice. The homicide investigation into Tracy Lee Tetso's death remains active and open as of this recording. No suspect has been publicly named. No arrest has been announced. Whoever is responsible for what happened to Tracy Lee Tetso in or around 1993 has not faced a single consequence in over 30 years. That is the case we are telling today. A story of a man lost to the woods and to time, of the forensic scientists and volunteer genealogists who refused to let him stay nameless, and of the very real possibility that someone watching this video right now has a piece of information that could finally close this case. So stay with us, because the second half of this story has not been written yet. This is True Crime Mysteries, and this is the case of Baldwin County John Doe, identified in 2023 as Tracy Lee Tetso. Context: a doe, a missing man, and 900 miles. Before we get into the timeline, let us take a moment to understand the geography of this case, because it matters more than almost anything else here. Baldwin County, Alabama, sits on the Gulf Coast. It is one of the largest counties by land area in the entire state of Alabama, stretching from the eastern shore of Mobile Bay all the way down to the white sand beaches along the Gulf of Mexico. It is a region of marshland and pine forests, long stretches of rural highway, and wooded areas that, in 1993, were even more isolated and sparse than they are today. The county seat is Bay Minette. The better-known towns, Foley, Daphne, Fairhope, Gulf Shores, were not yet the developed tourist destinations they would later become. In 1993, much of Baldwin County was exactly the kind of place where something could be hidden and stay hidden for a very long time. Now hold that image in your mind, and shift your perspective about 900 miles to the northeast. To Maryland, to the mid-Atlantic coast. A completely different landscape, a completely different community, a completely different world. That is where Tracy Lee Tetso lived. That is where, at some point before 1993, someone noticed he was gone and reported him missing. The exact details of Tetso's life in Maryland, his occupation, his day-to-day circumstances, the people closest to him, have not been fully laid out in the public record as of this reporting. But the public record is clear on the essential point. Tracy Lee Tetso was a real person from Maryland. He was reported missing, and his remains were eventually found in a wooded area of Baldwin County, Alabama, where they would go unidentified for approximately 30 years. Think about that gap for just a moment. A man goes missing from the East Coast. His remains turn up in a wooded area in coastal Alabama. And for 3 decades, no one makes the connection. No database match. No official link between the missing person report in Maryland and the John Doe case in Alabama. How does that happen? The answer to that question tells us a great deal about both the failures of the system as it existed in 1993 and the enormous strides that forensic science and missing persons databases have made in the years since. We will get into all of it. But first, let us go back to where this story begins, to a wooded area in Baldwin County, Alabama, in 1993. And the discovery that started 30 years of unanswered questions. Beat 1. The discovery in the woods, 1993. The year 1993 feels like a different era now, and in many ways, it was. The internet existed, but it had not yet reached most households. DNA forensics were in their relative infancy. The first use of DNA to solve a criminal case had only occurred in the mid-1980s, and the National CODIS DNA database did not begin collecting profiles until 1998. Missing persons reporting was fragmented, handled largely on a state-by-state basis with no centralized national system that could effectively cross-reference a missing person in Maryland with unidentified remains in Alabama. If you disappeared in one state and someone found your remains in another, the chances of those two data points ever connecting were slim, and that is not an exaggeration. That is simply how the system worked, or, more accurately, how it failed to work, in 1993. Into that context, place a discovery in a wooded area of Baldwin County, Alabama. According to public statements from the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office and reporting by local news outlets including Al.com, WKRG, and Fox 10 News Mobile, skeletal remains were found in a wooded area of Baldwin County in 1993. The remains were skeletal, meaning the time between death and discovery had allowed for significant decomposition. That fact alone tells us something important. Whoever was responsible for this was not dealing with a fresh crime scene that had just been stumbled upon. This was a victim who had been out there for some period of time before being discovered. Investigators with the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene and began their examination. Based on the evidence present, they determined that the death was a homicide. The specific nature of that evidence, the details that pointed investigators toward a criminal ruling rather than an accident or natural causes, has not been fully disclosed in public records or reporting as of this script. That is not unusual. In an active homicide investigation, especially one that has spanned decades, law enforcement routinely holds certain evidentiary details close to the chest. They do that for a reason. Those undisclosed details may one day become the key to confirming or eliminating information that comes in from a tip. What we do know, from public records and official statements, is that investigators looked at what was in front of them and concluded, this was not an accident. This was a crime. And so, the case was opened as a homicide investigation. But investigators immediately ran into a wall that would define the next 3 decades of this case. They had no idea who the victim was. With skeletal remains and no identifying documents found at the scene, the forensic options available in 1993 were limited compared to what exists today. Investigators could document physical characteristics, estimated age, height, sex, any notable features of the bones themselves. They could preserve whatever biological material was available. They could enter the case into whatever regional or national systems existed at the time for tracking unidentified remains. But without a DNA database robust enough to produce a match, without a national missing persons system that could easily cross-reference across state lines, and without the forensic genealogy tools that would not be developed for another decade or more, they were working with a very short deck of cards. The remains were documented, the case was logged, and the victim was assigned a name that was not a name at all. Baldwin County John Doe, a geographic identifier and a gender designation. That was the sum total of this person's official identity in the public record for the next 30 years. Baldwin County John Doe, 1993. Now, here is something I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is easy to move through true crime cases and lose sight of the human reality underneath the procedural language. Somewhere, in Maryland, according to public reporting, someone was missing Tracy Lee Tetso. At some point, someone filed a missing persons report. Someone marked him as gone. And then, in the absence of any information about what had happened to him, that person or those people were left in the cruelest kind of limbo that exists. The limbo of not knowing. Not knowing if he was alive somewhere. Not knowing if he had chosen to disappear. Not knowing if he was hurt, or in danger, or already beyond all help. That kind of uncertainty does not heal with time. It compounds. It calcifies. It becomes a wound that never quite closes because there is never any clear answer about what you are supposed to be grieving. And Tracy Lee Tetso, the man at the center of that grief and that uncertainty, was out there in the woods of Baldwin County, Alabama, unidentified, unclaimed, waiting for someone to find the connection that no one in 1993 had the tools to make. The case went cold, not immediately. Investigators, to their credit, would return to it over the years, as we will discuss. But in the practical sense, in the sense that no identification was made and no arrest followed, the case entered a state of suspended animation that would last for approximately 30 years. Let me pause here to give you a sense of what Baldwin County looked like as a crime scene context in 1993. This was not a small, easily contained area. Baldwin County is the largest county in Alabama by land area, covering over 1,590 square miles. Much of that area is rural, wooded, and sparsely populated in its interior regions. The discovery of remains in a wooded area of such a county tells us something and tells us nothing at the same time. It tells us the victim was in an isolated location, the kind of place a person might not be found quickly after death. It tells us that whoever left him there may have known the area, or may have simply driven until the trees were thick enough and the road was empty enough. It does not, on its own, tell us where Tracy Lee Tetso was last seen, how he traveled from Maryland to Alabama, or who was with him at the end. Those are the questions that would haunt this case for 3 decades. And as the 1990s turned into the 2000s, and the 2000s turned into the 2010s, those questions remained as unanswered as they had been on the day the remains were first found. Beat 2. 30 years of silence, and a missing man in Maryland. Here's a question I want to put to you directly, and I want you to think about it as we work through this next section. If a person goes missing in one state, and their remains are found in another state 900 miles away, what would it take for those two facts to find each other? What systems would need to be in place? What information would need to be shared? And what happens when those systems do not exist, or do not talk to each other, or simply are not robust enough to bridge that kind of geographic distance? That question sits at the heart of why this case remained unsolved for as long as it did. And understanding the answer to it means understanding both the history of missing persons infrastructure in the United States and the specific circumstances that kept Tracy Lee Tetso and the Baldwin County John Doe case separated in the official record for approximately 30 years. Let us start with what we know about Tracy Lee Tetso from public reporting. Based on statements from the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office and coverage by outlets including AL.com and local Gulf Coast television news, Tracy Lee Tetso was a resident of Maryland. He had been reported missing prior to the discovery of his remains in Alabama. That is the core of what public records and reporting confirm about him. The specific details of his life, his age at the time of his disappearance, his exact circumstances in Maryland, the people in his life who filed the missing report, have not been fully laid out in publicly available sources as of this script. What we can say with certainty, because it is confirmed by the logic of the case itself, is this. Tracy Lee Tetso was a human being with a life. He had people who noticed when he was gone. He existed in the world. And then he did not, at least not in the way anyone around him could account for. And for the next 30 years, while investigators in Alabama had his remains and investigators or family members in Maryland had his absence, no official thread connected those two realities. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on the infrastructure problem, because it is genuinely important to understanding cold cases of this era, not just this case, but dozens of others like it. In 1993, there was no NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, the federal clearinghouse that allows investigators and the public to cross-reference missing persons and unidentified remains cases across state lines, did not exist in that form. NamUs was developed in the mid-2000s and became more broadly operational in the years that followed. Before that, information sharing between states on missing persons cases depended heavily on individual agencies proactively reaching out to each other, on detectives who happened to be plugged into the right networks, and on a degree of luck that, in many cold cases, simply never materialized. Think about what that means in practice. A missing persons report is filed in Maryland. It goes into the Maryland system. Investigators there work it from the Maryland end, looking for leads in the places Tracy Lee Tetso was known to frequent, talking to the people in his life, following whatever trail existed from where he was last seen. Meanwhile, in Alabama, 900 miles away, a set of unidentified skeletal remains sits in the evidence system of the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office, entered into whatever databases and systems were available in 1993. The two cases exist in parallel, each one missing the piece that would unlock the other, and there is no automatic mechanism that says, wait, could this be that person? That gap, that 900-mile, multi-state, pre-digital gap, that is what kept Tracy Lee Tetso anonymous for 3 decades. Now, over the years, the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office did not simply abandon the case. Cold cases rarely get officially closed, and the better departments continue to revisit them when resources allow, when new tools become available, or when new information comes in. Public records and reporting indicate that the case was entered into NamUs as that system became available and more widely used, making the unidentified remains accessible for cross-referencing in a way that had not previously been possible. That is a significant step, even if it did not immediately produce results. It meant that the case was visible to other investigators, to forensic specialists, and, importantly, to the online communities of amateur sleuths who would play a meaningful role in keeping cases like this one from disappearing entirely from public consciousness. And here I want to take a moment to acknowledge something that does not always get the recognition it deserves in mainstream media coverage of cold cases. Online communities dedicated to unidentified persons, communities like the Reddit forums at r Grateful Doe and r Unresolved Mysteries, perform a kind of sustained public attention to these cases that official channels sometimes cannot maintain. Members of these communities review NamUs entries, compare physical descriptions to missing persons databases, raise awareness of specific cases, and occasionally generate tips or make connections that feed back into official investigations. The Baldwin County John Doe case was discussed in these communities over the years, according to public Reddit threads that reference the case. People cared, people paid attention, people kept asking the question that justice demanded someone keep asking: who is this man, and what happened to him? That kind of sustained public attention matters. It matters because it keeps pressure on the system. It matters because it means that if new tools become available, there is a community of people ready to advocate for using those tools. And it matters because the families of missing persons, who may themselves stumble across these discussions, are reminded that they are not alone in wanting answers. Now, at some point in the evolution of this case, and the specific timeline details of when this was revisited and by whom have not been fully laid out in public records, investigators returned to the Baldwin County John Doe case with a tool that did not exist in 1993. A tool that, in the past decade and a half, has transformed cold case investigations in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to detectives working in the early 1990s. That tool is investigative genetic genealogy. And it is the reason that in 2023, Tracy Lee Tetso finally got his name back. But before we get to 2023, I want to linger for just another moment on the weight of those 30 years. Because we can talk about databases and forensic tools and cross-state coordination failures in a way that makes this all feel very procedural, very abstract. But the reality is not abstract at all. For 30 years, a family somewhere, in Maryland, most likely, was living with the open wound of a missing loved one. For 30 years, Tracy Lee Tetso lay in a wooded area of a county he may never have visited voluntarily, reduced in the official record to a placeholder identity. For 30 years, whoever is responsible for putting him there was free. Free to go about their life, to wake up every morning, to sleep every night, without a single public consequence for what the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office has officially designated a homicide. 30 years. Think about everything that happened in the world in those 30 years. Think about how much time that is. And then tell me this case does not deserve every ounce of attention and scrutiny we can bring to it. Let me ask you something directly. If you lived in Baldwin County in 1993, or if you knew Tracy Lee Tetso, or if you have any memory, however fragmentary, however seemingly insignificant, of something that connects to this case, what would it take for you to come forward? What would need to be true for you to pick up the phone and make that call to the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office? Because the investigators working this case are asking exactly that question. They need someone to answer it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And keep watching, because the next chapter of this case is where the science gets truly remarkable. Beat 3. The 2023 IDENTIFICATION, and a killer still at large. To understand what happened in 2023, you first need to understand a little bit about how investigative genetic genealogy works, because it is one of the most powerful developments in forensic science in recent history, and it is the reason that cases like Baldwin County John Doe, cases that sat cold for decades, are being solved at a rate that would have been unimaginable 30 years ago. Here is the basic concept, explained in plain language. When investigators have biological remains, bones, teeth, hair, tissue, they can, under the right conditions, extract DNA. Not just any DNA, but specific genetic markers that can be used for comparison and identification. Traditional forensic DNA work compares a sample to a known reference, a family member's DNA, a sample from a suspect, a profile already in a law enforcement database like CODIS. But for unidentified remains where no known reference exists, that traditional approach often hits a wall. If no one in the DNA database matches the remains, you are stuck. Investigative genetic genealogy changes the equation entirely. Instead of looking for a direct match in a law enforcement database, forensic scientists upload the DNA profile to public genealogy databases, the kind that millions of ordinary people have contributed to voluntarily through consumer ancestry testing services. The goal is not to find the victim directly. The goal is to find relatives. Distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share enough genetic material with the victim to appear as a match in the database, even if they never met him and have no idea who he is. Once those distant relatives are identified, volunteer genealogists build out family trees, tracing branches, cross-referencing historical records, identifying which branches of the family include individuals who fit the approximate profile of the remains. Through a process of systematic elimination and tree building, investigators gradually narrow the field until they arrive at a name. It is painstaking, methodical work. It can take months or even years. And it requires a specific combination of advanced DNA sequencing technology and skilled genealogy research that, for a long time, was not available to most law enforcement agencies, especially smaller county sheriff's offices working on cold cases with limited budgets. That is where two organizations come in, and it is worth taking a moment to understand what each of them does, because they represent the infrastructure that made Tracy Lee Tetso's identification possible. The first is Othram. Based in the Woodlands, Texas, Othram is a private forensic genomics laboratory that specializes in recovering and sequencing DNA from difficult or degraded samples, exactly the kind of samples that come from remains that have been in the ground for decades. Their proprietary technology, branded under the platform Unsolved, allows them to extract usable genetic information from samples that traditional forensic labs might write off as too degraded to work with. According to their public case announcements, Othram has been involved in identifying hundreds of unidentified individuals and solving dozens of cold case homicides. They are, in a very real sense, the laboratory that makes the impossible possible when it comes to these cases. The second organization is the DNA Doe Project. The DNA Doe Project is a nonprofit organization composed largely of volunteer forensic genealogists, trained professionals and skilled amateurs who donate their time and expertise to building the family trees that ultimately identify John and Jane Does. Their work is not glamorous. It does not involve dramatic confrontations or interrogation rooms. It involves sitting at a computer, cross-referencing genealogy records, tracing family lines back through generations, and patiently eliminating possibilities until the answer emerges. The DNA Doe Project has been involved in dozens of successful identifications, and their partnership with Othram has become one of the most productive collaborations in modern cold case work. It was this combination, Othram's advanced DNA sequencing and the DNA Doe Project's genealogical research, working in partnership with the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office, that finally put a name to the remains that had been sitting in the evidence record since 1993. According to the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office public announcement in 2023 and reporting by AL.com, WKRG, FOX10 News Mobile, and the Othram Unsolved's case page, the Baldwin County John Doe was identified as Tracy Lee Tetso, a resident of Maryland. Let me be precise about what that announcement represents, because it is both a tremendous achievement and only one half of what justice requires. The identification tells us who the victim was. It answers the 30-year-old question of his name, his origin, his humanity. It gives his family, whoever is left, whoever has been waiting, the ability to finally know what happened to their loved one, at least in the most basic sense of knowing that he is gone and that he was found. That is not a small thing. For families of the missing, that kind of closure, however painful, is something they may have given up hope of ever receiving. But it does not tell us who killed him. It does not tell us how he ended up in a wooded area of Baldwin County, Alabama. It does not put anyone in a courtroom. And as of the time of this recording, per public statements from the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office, no suspect has been publicly named and no arrest has been announced in connection with Tracy Lee Tetso's death. The homicide investigation is ongoing. The case is active. The person responsible for what happened to Tracy Lee Tetso has, as far as public records indicate, not yet faced accountability. Now, let us think carefully about the investigative challenge that faces the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office in 2023 and beyond. Because this is not a straightforward cold case in the usual sense. This is a cold case with a very specific and very difficult complication. The victim came from Maryland, and the crime scene, or at least the scene where the remains were found, is in Alabama, over 900 miles away. That geographic separation means that the evidence, the witnesses, and the leads may not cluster neatly around one jurisdiction. The story of what happened to Tracy Lee Tetso may have started hundreds of miles from where it ended. The last people to see him alive may have been in Maryland, or somewhere along the route between Maryland and Alabama, or in Baldwin County itself. The possible geography of this investigation spans the entire eastern seaboard. What that means practically is that investigators need information from multiple directions. They need people from Tracy Lee Tetso's life in Maryland, people who knew him, who saw him in the period before he was reported missing, who might have information about his movements or the circumstances around his disappearance. They need people from the Baldwin County, Alabama area who may remember something from 1993, a face, a vehicle, an interaction that seemed off, something they may have carried with them for 30 years not knowing it was relevant. They need anyone, anywhere along the corridor between those 2 points, who has a piece of this puzzle. And here is the thing about information in a case like this. In 30 years, circumstances change. People who might once have been afraid to come forward may no longer have the same reasons to stay silent. People who were young in 1993 are older now, with different perspectives and different priorities. Relationships that existed in 1993 may have dissolved or soured. The loyalties and fears that kept a secret for 3 decades may not be as powerful as they once were. If you know something, anything, about what happened to Tracy Lee Tetso, this is your moment. The investigation is active, the investigators want to hear from you, and the statute of limitations on murder in Alabama does not expire. I want to take a step back and look at this case from a higher altitude for a moment, because it represents something larger than itself. The identification of Tracy Lee Tetso in 2023 is one example in what is becoming a wave of cold case resolutions made possible by investigative genetic genealogy. Othram and the DNA Doe project alone have been involved in dozens of similar cases in recent years. The technology is improving. The genealogy databases are growing as more people submit DNA through consumer ancestry services. The methodology is becoming more refined and more accessible to law enforcement agencies of all sizes. What that means is that if you committed a homicide and hid behind the anonymity of an unidentified victim, that anonymity is no longer the protection it once was. Science is catching up, and it is catching up fast. The identification of Tracy Lee Tetso is proof of that. For 30 years, the remains in Baldwin County were a dead end, literally and figuratively. There was no name, no direction, no thread to pull. And then, through a combination of advanced genomic sequencing and painstaking genealogical research, investigators finally had a name. That name opens doors. It creates leads. It gives investigators a new starting point after 30 years of standing at a closed one. Here is another question I want to put to you, because I think it is important and I think the people watching this channel think seriously about these cases. What kind of information could break this case open now? What would a witness from 1993 need to remember, or be willing to share, for investigators to have a viable path forward? Because here is the reality. In a 30-year-old cold case with a victim from one state and a crime scene in another, the single most valuable resource investigators have is the public. Tips, memories, pieces of information that people have been carrying for decades without knowing what to do with them. That is where the next break in this case is most likely to come from. Not from a laboratory, at this point. From a person, maybe from someone watching this very video. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have actual information about this case, please, contact the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office directly. We will put their information in the description below this video. Now let us talk about what the 2023 identification changes for the investigative landscape going forward, and what it means for the family of Tracy Lee Tetso. For the family, and here I am speaking carefully, because the details of who constitutes Tracy Lee Tetso's surviving family and their current circumstances have not been fully laid out in public records or reporting, the 2023 identification represents a form of closure that is partial but profound. The question of what happened to their missing loved one has been partially answered. He died in Alabama, his death was ruled a homicide, and his remains have been identified. What has not been answered, and what cannot be answered until the homicide investigation is resolved, is who did this and why. That gap between identification and justice is a real and painful one for families in these situations. It is one thing to know your loved one is gone. It is another thing entirely to know he was killed and to have no one held accountable. The Baldwin County Sheriff's Office, per their public statements, has explicitly asked for the public's help. That is not a formality. That is an acknowledgement that 30 years after the crime, the traditional investigative avenues, forensic evidence from the scene, witness interviews conducted close to the time of the event, contemporaneous records, have their limits. The public is now the most important investigative resource available. According to reporting from AL.com and local Gulf Coast television news outlets, investigators are asking anyone with information about Tracy Lee Tetso, his travels, his associations, the circumstances around his disappearance from Maryland, or anything that might connect him to Baldwin County, Alabama, to come forward. That call has been public since 2023. Every day that passes without a response is another day that justice is delayed. I want to also take a moment to acknowledge the role that the DNA Doe Project's volunteers played in this outcome, because it is genuinely remarkable. These are people who are not paid by law enforcement. They are not professional investigators in the traditional sense, though many have extensive training and expertise. They are people who believe that every unidentified person deserves to have their name restored, that the placeholder identities assigned to John and Jane Doe are temporary indignities that should be corrected. They give their time, their skills, and their emotional energy to cases that law enforcement may not have the resources to pursue aggressively. And in the case of Tracy Lee Tetso, that work paid off. 30 years of anonymity, undone by science and dedication. The partnership between Othram, the DNA Doe Project, and agencies like the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office represents a model for cold case work that is likely to become more common in the years ahead. It is a model that acknowledges the limits of what any single agency can do on its own, and it is a model that has proven, in case after case, that the question is not whether these old cases can be solved, it is whether the resources and the will to solve them exist. In the case of Tracy Lee Tetso, the first half of that question has been answered. The identification is done, the name is restored. The second half, the homicide investigation, the accountability, the justice, that is still in progress. Let me bring this all together now as we move toward the resolution of what we know and the open question of what still needs to be answered. Resolution: named, but not yet justice. For 30 years, the remains of a man from Maryland lay in the evidence record of a county in coastal Alabama, known to the world by a name that was not a name. Baldwin County John Doe, a designation that erased everything he was, his relationships, his history, his humanity, and replaced it with a location and a demographic. That is a kind of violence that compounds the original violence done to him. And for 30 years, there was no way to undo it. Then, in 2023, through the combined efforts of the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office, Othram's Forensic Genomics Laboratory, and the volunteer genealogists of the DNA Doe Project, that 30-year erasure was reversed. The remains were identified as those of Tracy Lee Tetso, a resident of Maryland who had been reported missing before his remains were discovered hundreds of miles from home. The identification was confirmed and publicly announced by the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office, and it was covered by local news outlets including AL.com, WKRG, and Fox 10 News Mobile, as well as documented on the Othram DNA Solves platform and the DNA Doe Project case page. Tracy Lee Tetso has his name back. That is real, and it matters, and the people who made it happen deserve enormous credit. But let me be unambiguous about what it means and what it does not mean. It means that investigators now have a named victim and a starting point for a reinvigorated homicide investigation. It means that his family, whoever they are, wherever they are, has some form of answer to a question they have been living with for decades. It means that the public can now put a name to a case instead of a placeholder. What it does not mean is that justice has been served. As of this recording, based on public statements from the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office and reporting from the outlets named above, no suspect in Tracy Lee Tetso's death has been publicly identified. No arrest has been announced. No charges have been filed. The homicide investigation is described as ongoing and active. Whoever is responsible for the death of Tracy Lee Tetso has, as far as the public record reflects, not yet been held accountable for what was done to him. The investigators working this case are doing so with the understanding that 30 years is a long time, but that justice has no expiration date. Cold cases have been solved after longer spans than this. Witnesses who stayed silent come forward. Evidence that seemed dead ends is re-examined with fresh eyes and new techniques. And genetic genealogy, which just cracked open the identity question after 30 years, may yet produce new leads in the homicide investigation itself. DNA technology does not stop at victim identification. The geographic complexity of this case, a victim from Maryland, remains in Alabama, presents real investigative challenges. But it also means there is a wide net of potential information. Anyone who knew Tracy Lee Tetso in Maryland. Anyone who had contact with him in the period before he was reported missing. Anyone who may have information about how or why he traveled to Alabama, or who he may have been with. Anyone in Baldwin County who remembers something from 1993 that, in light of this identification, might now carry new meaning. All of that information is valuable. All of it is potentially case-breaking. And investigators need it. The Baldwin County Sheriff's Office has made clear that they want to hear from the public. That is not a courtesy, it is an urgent request in an active homicide investigation. If you have information, any information, please contact them. Do not assume that what you know is too small or too old or too uncertain to matter. In cold cases, the smallest detail can be the one that breaks everything open. The investigators know how to evaluate what comes in. Your job is to make the call. Tracy Lee Tetso deserved better than 30 years of anonymity in the woods of a county far from home. He deserved better than 3 decades as a placeholder in a case file. He has his name back now. The least we can do, the least justice demands, is that we do not let the second half of his story go untold as well. For 30 years, nobody knew who he was. In 2023, they gave him back his name. The next chapter belongs to whoever is watching this video with a piece of information they have not yet shared. The next chapter could be written by you. Call to action in closing. If this case has stayed with you, and I think if you have made it this far, it has, I want to ask you to do a few things. First, share this video. Share it widely, and share it specifically in communities or networks connected to Maryland, to Baldwin County, Alabama, or to the Gulf Coast region. The more eyes on this case, the better the chances that the right person sees it and remembers something they did not realize they knew. Second, if you have actual information about Tracy Lee Tetso, his life in Maryland, his travels, the circumstances around his disappearance, or anything that might connect him to Baldwin County, Alabama, please contact the Baldwin County Sheriff's Office directly. Their contact information is in the description below this video. Do not contact them through us. Contact them directly. This is an active homicide investigation and investigators need to hear from you. Third, if you want to support the work being done by the organizations that made this identification possible, the DNA Doe Project accepts donations and the Othram Unsolved platform allows the public to contribute directly to specific cases. The links are in the description. That work saves names. It restores humanity to people who were reduced to placeholders. It matters, and it is underfunded, and your support makes more cases possible. If you think you know something about what happened to Tracy Lee Tetso, drop your thoughts in the comments below. We review every comment on this channel, and this community has sharp eyes and long memories. You may make a connection that matters. And if you found value in this responsibly reported coverage of a case that the mainstream media has not always given sustained attention, please like this video and subscribe to True Crime Mysteries, and turn on notifications so you do not miss our coverage every week. Every like, every subscription, every share helps us continue covering cases like this one. Cases where a real person deserves to be more than a cold case file number. Tracy Lee Tetso, a man from Maryland, found in the woods of Baldwin County, Alabama, in 1993. Identified in 2023 through the remarkable work of forensic genealogy. Victim of a homicide that remains unsolved. And a person who, whatever his story was, whatever his life held, deserved better than what was done to him, and deserves the full measure of justice that the law can provide. His case is not closed. His story is not finished. The killer is still out there. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.